fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the walls of Ellie's small cabin as the 7 Comanche warriors stepped inside, their presence filling the room in a way it hadn't been filled in years. Water dripped from their clothes onto the wooden floor, and the scent of rain and leather and horses clung to them, mixing with the smell of burning pine and the faint aroma of the stew Ellie had been cooking since morning. She stood near the fireplace, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, watching as the men moved with quiet purpose, shaking out their wet hair, unstrapping their gear, their eyes taking in every corner of her home with careful curiosity. The leader, Tahoma, was the tallest of them, his shoulders broad beneath his damp buckskin shirt, his face stern but not unkind. He removed his hat, revealing dark hair tied back with a leather cord, and nodded once to Ellie in silent thanks. The others followed his lead. Kitchi, the quiet one with watchful eyes, Nantan, whose grin flashed bright even in the dim light, Diani, the eldest, whose face was lined with wisdom, and the 3 younger warriors whose names Ellie did not yet know. They moved with the ease of men used to sharing space, used to silence, used to waiting out storms. Ellie swallowed hard. She had not had guests in so long that she had forgotten what to do with them. "There's stew," she said, her voice softer than she meant it to be. "Enough to share if you're hungry." Tahoma's gaze met hers, and for a moment, she felt as if he could see straight through her, past the nervousness, past the years of solitude, straight to the part of her that still remembered how to hope. Then he nodded again. "We are grateful," he said, and though his words were few, they carried a weight that settled deep in Ellie's chest. She busied herself with bowls and spoons, her hands trembling slightly as she ladled out the stew. The men sat where they could, on the floor, on the edge of her bed, on the single stool she owned, and ate without speaking, the only sounds the scrape of spoons and the occasional murmur of approval. Ellie watched them from the corner of her eye, studying the way they moved, the way they seemed so at ease in this strange place. She had heard stories about the Comanche, of course, tales of raids and battles, whispered warnings from neighbors who had long since moved away. But these men did not seem like the monsters from those stories. They were just men, tired and hungry, seeking shelter from the storm. When the meal was finished, Nantan, the one with the easy smile, leaned forward, his eyes bright. "Your roof," he said, pointing upward. "It leaks." Ellie blinked. She had grown so used to the constant drip-drip of water into the bucket by her bed that she hardly noticed it anymore. "Yes," she admitted. "I haven't been able to fix it." Nantan grinned wider. "We fix it," he declared, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. Ellie opened her mouth to protest, but before she could speak, Tahoma stood. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "When the storm passes." And just like that, it was decided. The night wore on, the storm raging outside, the fire burning low. The warriors spoke little, but their presence was a living thing, filling the cabin with a warmth that had nothing to do with the hearth. Ellie found herself stealing glances at Tahoma, at the way the firelight played across his strong features, at the quiet strength in his hands as he stoked the flames. She told herself it was just curiosity, just the strangeness of having company after so long alone. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. When at last the men settled down to sleep, some on the floor, some outside beneath the shelter of the porch, Ellie lay in her bed, staring up at the ceiling, listening to the steady breathing of strangers in her home. She should have been afraid. She should have been counting the hours until they left. But instead, for the first time in years, she did not feel alone. And that scared her more than any storm ever could. The prairies stretched endlessly under the vast, open sky, a sea of golden grass swaying in the wind like waves upon an ocean of earth. The sun blazed in the afternoon heat, casting long shadows from the few scattered trees that dared to grow in that lonely land. And there, nestled beside a slow-moving creek, stood a small wooden cabin, its walls weathered by years of wind and rain, its chimney puffing thin curls of smoke into the air. This was the home of Ellie, a woman who had known solitude for so long that the silence had become her closest companion. She was neither young nor old, but time had etched its marks upon her face, lines from squinting into the sun, from nights spent worrying over the harvest, from the quiet sorrow of losing those she loved. Her parents had passed years ago, leaving her alone with nothing but the land, her horsebuck, and the memories of a family that once filled these walls with laughter. Now, the only sounds were the creak of the rocking chair on the porch, the distant call of a hawk circling overhead, and the steady rhythm of her own breathing as she worked. Ellie was a woman of simple routines. She rose with the dawn, fed Buck, tended to her small garden where beans and squash fought against the stubborn earth, and patched the parts of the cabin that the wind tried to claim. In the evenings, she sat by the fire with her worn Bible, whispering prayers that disappeared into the empty air. Sometimes, she wondered if God even heard her anymore. She had asked for company, for someone, anyone, to break the stillness of her days. But the prairie gave no answers, only the endless sigh of the wind. Then came the storm. It rolled in from the west like a great, growling beast, black clouds swallowing the sun whole. Thunder shook the ground, and lightning split the sky like cracks in a shattered mirror. Ellie hurried to secure the shutters, her heart pounding as the wind howled around the cabin like a thing alive. Buck whinnied nervously in the barn, and she whispered to him, "Easy now, boy. It'll pass." But as she turned to go back inside, a sound cut through the storm. Asterisk, asterisk, hooves, asterisk, asterisk. Not the light, quick steps of deer or the occasional stray cattle, but the heavy, deliberate thud of horses ridden hard. Her breath caught in her throat. No one came this way. No one at all. Then, out of the rain and darkness, they appeared. 7 riders. Tall, broad-shouldered, their faces shadowed beneath the brims of their hats, their clothes soaked from the storm. Their horses stamped and snorted, steam rising from their flanks in the cold downpour. At their lead was a man with eyes like dark flint, his gaze steady and unreadable. He raised a hand in greeting, but Ellie's fingers tightened around the doorframe. Strangers. Men she did not know. Men who could mean danger. The leader spoke, his voice deep and calm despite the storm. Asterisk, we seek shelter. Asterisk. Ellie's heart hammered. Every instinct told her to shut the door, to bolt it tight, and wait for them to leave. But then she remembered her father's words, spoken long ago when a traveler had come begging for bread. Asterisk, a closed door turns away angels as easily as devils. Asterisk, swallowing her fear, she stepped back.
"Come in," she said.
And with that, the loneliness of the prairie began to fade. A silent bond. Dawn crept across the prairie like a shy child, painting the sky in soft hues of pink and gold as the storm clouds retreated into memory. Ellie awoke to the unfamiliar sound of voices outside her cabin, low, murmuring words in a language she did not understand, punctuated by the occasional burst of laughter. For one disorienting moment, she lay still, blinking at the rough-hewn beams above her bed, wondering if she had dreamed the presence of the 7 warriors. Then the scent of smoke and frying meat curled through her open window, and she remembered. She dressed quickly, her fingers fumbling with the buttons of her worn dress, and stepped out onto the porch. The morning air was crisp and clean, washed fresh by the rain, and the grass glittered with droplets that caught the sunlight like scattered jewels. The sight that greeted her made her breath catch. The warriors were already at work. Nantan balanced effortlessly on the roof, his nimble fingers weaving new thatch into the damaged spots while Kitchi handed up bundles of dried grass from below. Diani sat cross-legged near the fire pit, turning strips of venison on a flat stone while the younger warriors tended to the horses. And Tahoma. Tahoma stood by the creek, shirtless, his skin gleaming with water as he washed the sleep from his face. The muscles of his back and shoulders moved like liquid beneath his skin, powerful and graceful all at once. Ellie felt her cheeks grow warm and quickly looked away, but not before Diani noticed her staring. The old warrior's eyes crinkled with silent amusement as he nodded toward the fire. "Eat," he said simply, pushing a wooden plate toward her. The venison was rich and smoky, flavored with wild herbs Ellie didn't recognize. She ate quietly, watching as the men moved about their tasks with an efficiency that spoke of long practice. There was no discussion, no arguing over who should do what. Each man simply knew his role and performed it without hesitation. It was so different from the solitary, plodding way Ellie had managed her homestead these past years, where every chore was a struggle against time and her own weary bones. As the morning wore on, Ellie found herself drawn into their rhythm. She carried water from the creek for Kitchi to mix with clay for chinking the cabin walls. She sorted through her meager stores of seeds while Diani explained which would thrive if planted differently. And when Nantan jumped down from the roof with a triumphant shout, "No more leaks!" she surprised herself by laughing aloud, the sound strange and bright in her own ears. Only Tahoma remained apart. Though he worked as hard as the others, digging a new drainage ditch around the cabin, reinforcing the sagging barn door, he spoke little and never initiated conversation. Yet Ellie often caught him watching her when he thought she wasn't looking, his dark eyes unreadable. It was near sunset when she finally crossed paths with him alone. She had gone to the creek to wash the day's dust from her hands and found him there, sitting on a flat rock, carving something from a piece of cedar wood. He didn't look up as she approached, but his shoulders tensed slightly, the knife in his hand pausing for just a moment before continuing its work. Ellie hesitated, then knelt a few feet away to splash water on her face. The silence between them stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt waiting, like the pause between lightning and thunder. "What are you making?" she asked at last, nodding toward his hands. Tahoma didn't answer immediately. Then, with a final few careful strokes of his knife, he held out the carving. It was a rose, its petals curled delicately inward, so lifelike Ellie half expected to smell its fragrance. The wood was still pale where the knife had cut, contrasting with the weathered brown of the older carvings on its stem, tiny leaves, thorns, all rendered with astonishing detail. "For you," he said, his voice so low it barely rose above the babble of the creek. Ellie reached out slowly, her fingers brushing his as she took the rose. His skin was warm and rough with calluses, and the contact sent an unexpected shiver up her arm. "It's beautiful," she whispered, tracing the grooves of the petals. "But why?" Tahoma's gaze held hers, steady and deep as the night sky. "Because you are like this flower," he said simply. "Strong enough to grow alone in hard ground." Then he stood and walked away, leaving Ellie by the creek with her heart pounding and the wooden rose clutched tight in her hand. That night, as the warriors prepared their bedrolls for sleep, Ellie lingered by the hearth, turning the carving over and over in her fingers. She thought of the way Tahoma had looked at her, of the careful way he'd shaped each petal. It was more than a gift, it was a message, one she wasn't sure how to answer. Outside, an owl called from the cottonwood tree. Somewhere in the darkness, a wolf howled, its voice rising and falling like a question. And in Ellie's chest, something long dormant began to stir. The second chance asterisk. The morning air hung heavy with unspoken words as Ellie stood in the doorway of her cabin, watching the warriors prepare to leave. Their horses stamped impatiently, their breath curling in white plumes against the chill of dawn. The repairs were finished, the roof no longer leaked. The barn door swung smoothly on its new hinges, and the garden had been turned and readied for planting. There was no reason for them to stay any longer. Yet Tahoma lingered. He stood apart from the others, his broad back turned to Ellie as he tightened the straps on his saddle. The wooden rose she had tucked into her apron pocket the night before seemed to burn against her thigh, a constant reminder of his quiet words by the creek. Strong enough to grow alone in hard ground. Nantan was the first to approach her, his ever-present grin softening into something more serious as he placed a small leather pouch in her hands.
"For your garden," he said.
"Seeds from our lands. They will grow strong here." Kitchi nodded to her, his dark eyes knowing, while Diani pressed a carved bone charm into her palm, a turtle, its shell patterned with tiny circles. "For protection," the old warrior murmured. "And wisdom." One by one, They mounted their horses, their farewells brief but warm. All except Tahoma. Ellie's heart hammered against her ribs as he finally turned to face her. The rising sun gilded the sharp planes of his face, catching in the dark depths of his eyes. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, the space between them charged like the air before a lightning strike. Then Tahoma spoke. "I stay." 2 words. 2 simple words that sent Ellie's world tilting. She opened her mouth, closed it again, her hands twisting in her apron.
"You."
"What?" Tahoma took a step closer, close enough that she could see the pulse beating in his throat, could smell the scent of leather and sage that clung to his skin. "My heart is here now," he said, his voice rough as river stones. "With you." The raw honesty in his words struck Ellie like a physical blow. She stumbled back, her shoulders hitting the doorframe. "No," she whispered. "You can't." Tahoma frowned, a flicker of pain crossing his features. "Why?" "Because." The word burst from Ellie like a dam breaking. "Because people leave. They always leave, or they die, and I can't." Her voice cracked, years of loneliness and grief rising like floodwaters. "I can't do it again." The other warriors had gone still, watching this exchange with guarded expressions. Diani's eyes were sad, as if he had expected this. Tahoma's jaw tightened. He reached out slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and cupped her cheek with one calloused hand. Ellie trembled at the contact, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. "I am not them," he said quietly, "but I will go if you ask." For one terrible, glorious moment, Ellie let herself lean into his touch. Then she wrenched away, wrapping her arms around herself like armor. "Go," she choked out. "Please." Tahoma's hand dropped to his side. He studied her face for a long moment, then nodded once, sharp and final. Without another word, he swung onto his horse and gathered the reins. Ellie stood frozen as the warriors rode away, their figures growing smaller and smaller against the vast expanse of prairie. When they disappeared over the rise, something inside her chest snapped like a dried twig. She sank to her knees in the dirt, the wooden rose tumbling from her pocket into the dust. The cabin had never felt so empty. Hours passed in a blur. Ellie moved through her chores like a ghost, her hands performing familiar tasks while her mind replayed that final moment over and over. The look in Tahoma's eyes, the warmth of his hand, the way he had honored her choice, even as it broke them both. Night fell, but Ellie couldn't bring herself to light the lamps. She sat in the growing darkness, staring at the cold hearth, the wooden rose clutched in her hand. Outside, an owl called a mournful sound that echoed the ache in her chest. Then, impossibly, another sound joined it, the soft crunch of footsteps on gravel. Ellie's head snapped up as the door creaked open. Diani stood there, his face shadowed in the moonlight. He said nothing, simply extended his hand. In his palm lay another carving, 2 birds, their wings intertwined. "Fear steals joy," the old warrior said softly. "Courage brings love." Something inside Ellie shattered. She surged to her feet, her decision crystallizing in an instant. Diani's knowing smile followed her as she grabbed her shawl and ran out into the night. Buck snorted in surprise as Ellie threw open the barn door and bridled him with shaking hands. She didn't bother with a saddle, just hauled herself onto his back and dug in her heels. The big horse leapt forward, his hooves pounding against the earth as they raced across the moonlit prairie. Wind tore at Ellie's hair, her tears drying cold on her cheeks. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to find him. A lone figure sat motionless on horseback atop a distant rise, silhouetted against the starry sky. As Ellie urged Buck up the slope, the figure turned. Even in the darkness, she would know that proud profile anywhere. Tahoma. Ellie slid from Buck's back before he'd fully stopped, her boots kicking up dust as she stumbled forward. Tahoma dismounted in one fluid motion, his face unreadable in the moonlight. Ellie's chest heaved. I was wrong, she gasped. Stay. If you still want me. For one heart-stopping moment, Tahoma didn't move. Then he crossed the distance between them in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms. Always, he whispered against her hair. And as the prairie wind swirled around them, Ellie realized she was home. A new family asterisk. The golden light of late afternoon spilled through the freshly repaired windows of Ellie's cabin, painting the wooden floor in long, honey-colored stripes. Outside, the rhythmic thud of an axe biting into wood echoed through the clearing, each strike measured and sure. Ellie paused in kneading her bread dough, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron as she peered out the window. Tahoma stood shirtless near the woodpile, his skin glistening with sweat as he split log after log with effortless strength. The muscles in his back and arms corded and released with each swing, his movements as natural as breathing. 3 weeks had passed since that moonlit night on the prairie, since she'd raced after him with her heart in her throat and asked him to stay. 3 weeks since her solitary life had been irrevocably changed. A warm flush crept up Ellie's neck as she watched him work. She turned back to her dough, pressing her knuckles into it with more force than necessary. It still felt strange, having someone else in her space, someone who left his boots by the door instead of neatly on the mat, who stacked firewood in a different pattern than she did, whose deep voice rumbled through the cabin at odd hours as he spoke to himself in Comanche while repairing tools. Strange, but not unwelcome. The axe blows stopped. Ellie heard the soft thump of the tool being set down, then the creak of the porch steps as Tahoma approached. She busied herself with the dough, shaping it into a round loaf, when the door opened behind her. You watch me. Ellie's hands stilled. She didn't turn around. I was checking if we needed more wood for. A warm hand settled on her waist, turning her gently. Tahoma stood close, so close she could see the individual beads of sweat trailing down his chest, could smell the sharp, clean scent of his skin mingled with wood smoke and pine. His dark eyes held hers, a knowing glint in their depths. You watch me, he repeated, softer this time. Ellie's mouth went dry. She lifted a floury hand, hesitated, then pressed it to his chest. His heartbeat thudded steady and strong beneath her palm. Maybe I like watching you, she murmured. Tahoma's slow smile could have lit the darkest night. He caught her wrist, bringing her flour-dusted fingers to his lips. Good, he said against her skin. Because I like being watched by you. The bread was forgotten after that. As summer deepened, the cabin grew and changed alongside their relationship. Tahoma added a new room with help from neighboring homesteaders who'd cautiously begun accepting his presence. Ellie learned to make pemmican and tan hides the Comanche way, her hands growing skilled with practice. In return, she taught Tahoma how to tend her garden, laughing when his enormous hands proved surprisingly gentle with delicate seedlings. One evening, as fireflies danced in the twilight outside their open door, Tahoma set down his whittling and fixed Ellie with a solemn look. We should marry. Ellie nearly dropped the shirt she was mending. What? Under Comanche ways, we are already husband and wife. Tahoma's mouth quirked. But I think you would like more. Ellie's pulse fluttered like a bird in her throat. She thought of the lonely years, of empty beds and silent meals. Then she looked at Tahoma, at the quiet strength in his face, the love in his eyes that needed no words, and nodded. Yes, she whispered. I would like that very much. The wedding was simple. Preacher Josiah rode out from town to perform the ceremony beneath their cottonwood tree, its leaves rustling like approving whispers. Nantan and Kitchi came, bearing gifts of finely tanned buckskin and a necklace of bear claws for Ellie. Neighbors who'd once crossed the street to avoid Tahoma now stood awkwardly by the food table, sampling venison stew and cornbread. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Tahoma didn't kiss her nod in front of everyone. But as they walked back to the cabin together, his fingers laced tightly with hers, speaking louder than any public display could. That night, as the last guests departed and firelight flickered across their bedroom walls, Tahoma traced the curve of Ellie's bare shoulder with reverent fingers. You are my heart, he said in Comanche, the words rough with emotion. Then in English, forever. Ellie curled into him, her head finding its perfect place against his chest. Outside, a coyote yipped in the distance, and the wind sighed through the grass. But inside their cabin, their home, there was only warmth and peace and the quiet certainty that she would never be alone again. The greatest gift, asterisk. Winter had come and gone, its icy grip giving way to the tender green shoots of spring when Ellie first noticed the change in her body. It began as a peculiar fluttering low in her belly, like butterfly wings brushing against her insides. Then came the mornings when the smell of coffee turned her stomach, when fatigue clung to her bones like damp wool despite full nights of sleep. She stood before the small mirror in their bedroom one cool April morning, her work-worn hands pressed against the subtle curve beneath her apron. The realization struck her with the force of a summer storm: she was with child. A choked sound escaped her lips. Memories flooded back unbidden, her mother's pale face against sweat-dampened sheets, the muffled sobs of her father in the night, the tiny grave at the edge of their property. Fear coiled tight around her ribs, squeezing until she could scarcely breathe. The cabin door creaked open, followed by the familiar heavy tread of Tahoma's boots. He paused in the bedroom doorway, his sharp eyes missing nothing. Ellie? She couldn't speak, couldn't force words past the lump in her throat. When she turned to face him, something in her expression made him cross the room in 2 long strides. His warm hands enveloped hers, still pressed against her belly. Understanding dawned in his dark eyes. For a moment, they simply stood there, the silence between them thick with unspoken hopes and fears. Then Tahoma sank to his knees before her, his face pressed against her stomach, his arms wrapping around her waist with surprising gentleness. "The Great Spirit gives us a great gift," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. Ellie's fingers tangled in his hair as tears spilled down her cheeks. "My mother." Tahoma looked up, his gaze steady as bedrock. "You are not your mother." He stood slowly, cradling her face between his calloused palms. "You are strong like the oak, and I will be with you every step." As the weeks passed and Ellie's belly swelled, Tahoma's quiet devotion became her anchor. He rose before dawn to complete her chores, refusing to let her lift anything heavier than a basket of mending. When summer's heat left her nauseated and weak, he fashioned a shade canopy near the creek where she could rest in the cool breeze. And at night, when fears came creeping like shadows at the edges of her mind, his strong arms held her close, his steady heartbeat lulling her to sleep. News of her condition spread through the scattered homesteads. Women who had barely nodded to Ellie in years now arrived with gifts, hand-knitted booties, jars of preserves, whispered advice about childbirth. Mrs. Henderson from the neighboring farm even offered her grandmother's rosehip tea, said to strengthen a mother's blood. "You see?" Tahoma murmured one evening as they watched yet another wagon depart after delivering a quilt. "You are not alone." Ellie smiled, resting a hand on her rounded belly where tiny kicks now fluttered regularly. The child, a son, Tahoma insisted with quiet certainty, was growing strong. The pains began on a crisp September night, sharp as butcher's knives slicing through her abdomen. Ellie bit back a cry, clutching the bedpost as another contraction racked her body. Moonlight streamed through the window, painting silver streaks across the floor where Tahoma paced like a caged wolf. "Get Mrs. McCready," Ellie gasped between clenched teeth. The midwife lived 3 miles east, a long ride in the dead of night. Tahoma's jaw tightened. "No time." Panic clawed at Ellie's throat. "But you don't know." "I know," he interrupted, his voice calm but brooking no argument. He set a pot of water to boil, his movements methodical as he laid out clean linens and the sharp hunting knife Ellie had secretly dreaded seeing. When he returned to her side, his hands were steady, his eyes full of quiet confidence. "Trust me." What followed were hours of agony that blurred together in Ellie's memory, the crushing pressure, the primal urge to push, Tahoma's voice anchoring her through each wave of pain. At some point, she became aware of another presence, old Mrs. Henderson hovering in the doorway, summoned by some sixth sense. The woman said little, just nodded approvingly at Tahoma's preparations and took up position at Ellie's head, mopping her brow with a cool cloth. When the final, searing pain tore through her and a thin, reedy cry pierced the air, Ellie collapsed back against the pillows, her body trembling with exhaustion. Tahoma's hands moved deftly, tying off the cord before wrapping the squirming infant in a soft blanket. His dark eyes shone with unshed tears as he placed the bundle in Ellie's arms. "Little Hawk," he whispered, brushing a finger over the baby's shock of black hair. Ellie traced her son's perfect features, the tiny nose that already looked like Tahoma's, the rosebud mouth working soundlessly. A love so fierce it hurt flooded her chest, stealing her breath. She looked up at Tahoma through her tears. "He's beautiful." Outside, the first light of dawn painted the eastern sky in streaks of gold and pink. The morning birds began their chorus, as if celebrating the new life cradled in Ellie's arms. Mrs. Henderson discreetly slipped away, leaving the young family to their first moments together. Tahoma sat on the edge of the bed, his large hand engulfing his son's tiny head with impossible gentleness. "Our greatest adventure begins," he murmured. Ellie leaned into his solid warmth, Little Hawk's soft breaths puffing against her neck. The ghosts of her past, the loneliness, the fear, the empty years faded like mist in morning sun. Here, in this moment, with her warrior's arms around her and their child's heartbeat against hers, she found a peace deeper than any she'd ever known. Forever Prairie *. 10 summers had come and gone since the night 7 Comanche warriors rode into Ellie's life, since the lonely prairie woman with guarded eyes became a wife. A mother. Chapter 7. A woman whose laughter now rang clear as birdsong. 10 summers had come and gone since the once stood solitary and weathered had grown into a sturdy homestead, since the lonely prairie woman with guarded eyes became a wife. Sprawling vegetable garden. A woman whose laughter now rang clear as birdsong. That Little Hawk tended with solemn responsibility. The cabin that once stood solitary and weathered had grown into a sturdy stood at the edge of her flower gardens, added with her hands resting on the gentle swell of another child growing within her daughter this time, and a chicken coop that Little Hawk tended with solemn responsibility. The late afternoon sun gilded the fields where golden wheat stood at the edge of her flower garden. A crop Tahoma had resting on the gentle swell of another child growing within her daughter. It hadn't been easy those first years. Saw sideways glances and hushed whispers. The late afternoon sun gilded the fields where golden children swayed in the breeze. When Tahoma walked by, Tahoma had taught their neighbors and relentless kindness had worn away suspicion. It hadn't been easy those first years. Saw sideways glances and hushed whispers. Ellie's attention to the creek where the way women pulled their children closer, when his dark hair plastered to his forehead. But time and relentless kindness had worn away suspicion. Tahoma stood waist deep in the water. His powerful frame still pulled Ellie's attention to the creek where Little Hawk splashed in the shallows through his dark hair plastered to his forehead. He caught their son mid-leap, his grin tossing him high into the air before catching him effortlessly. Tahoma stood waist deep in the water, laughter bubbling up like the creek over rocks. Still as imposing as the day they met. Again, though silver now threaded through his black braid. Using the Comanche word for father that had been his first spoken word, tossing him high into the air before catching him effortlessly as she watched them. The boy's laughter bubbling up childhood was over her own, surrounded by love. Again, by the traditions of two cultures. Little Hawk demanded, father whose steady presence was word for father that had been his first spoken word. The wooden rose Tahoma Ellie's heart had carved her all those years ago sat on their mantle. How different her son's childhood was from her own, surrounded by love. Handling. By the traditions of how far they'd come, by a father whose steady presence was as constant Tahoma as the North Star. His eyes finding hers across the distance had carved her all those even years ago. All this sat time on their mantle. That simple glance worn could still make her years of handling. He said something to Little Hawk before wading toward shore, as if sensing water sluicing off his muscular frame. Tahoma looked up. His eyes finding hers across the distance. He chided gently even as after all this time, placing a damp hand on her belly where their daughter kicked in response. He said something to Little Hawk before wading toward shore. I was resting. Water sluicing off someone started hollering loud enough to scare the crows. You're supposed to be resting. Tahoma's he chided gently as chuckle rumbled against her placing side, a damp hand on her belly, where their daughter they stood together watching Little Hawk attempt to catch swatted at him with bare hands. I was resting, poking out in concentration. Then someone started hollering loud enough to scare the crows. She was kneading bread. Tahoma's deep chuckle
tomorrow.
rumbled against her side.
Tahoma said
as he
after a
pulled
while.
her close. With others
They
from the
stood
band,
together watching little Hawk
Ellie
attempt
nodded,
to catch minnows
leaning
with his
into
bare
his
hands.
solid warmth.
His tongue
The
poking out
Comanche
in
visited
concentration,
regularly now,
just like
their
Ellie
initial
did when
wariness
she was
replaced
kneading
by
bread.
genuine affection, especially for
comes
little
tomorrow,
Hawk, who could switch
Tahoma
between
said after a
English
while,
and Comanche
with others
as
from the band.
easily as breathing.
Ellie nodded,
Diani,
leaning into
older
his
and
solid
slower
warmth.
but still
The
sharp-eyed,
Comanche visited
had become
regularly
a grandfather
now,
figure to
their
the boy,
initial wariness
teaching him
replaced by
stories
genuine
and
affection,
skills passed
especially
down
for
through
little Hawk,
generations, who could switch between
Think they'll
English
stay
and
through the
Comanche
harvest?
as
Ellie
easily
asked.
as breathing.
Tahoma pressed a kiss
older
to her
and
temple.
slower but still
Longer.
sharp-eyed,
They want
had
to be
become
here
a
when she
grandfather
comes.
figure to the boy,
His hands
teaching him
splayed
stories
over her
and
belly
skills
again.
passed down through
The simple
generations.
certainty in his
Think
voice
they'll
that there would
stay
be a
through the
harvest,
that their
Ellie
daughter would
asked.
arrive safely,
Tahoma
that their
pressed a
family
kiss
would
to her
continue
temple.
growing, filled
Longer.
Ellie with
They want to
quiet
be
wonder.
here when she
The
comes.
lonely girl
His
she'd once
hands
been
splayed
could never
over
have
her belly
imagined
again.
this life.
The
This
simple
love,
certainty in
this
his voice that there would be a
unshakable
harvest,
sense of belonging, that their
As
daughter would
the
arrive
sun dipped
safely,
lower,
that their
painting the
family
prairie
would
in
continue
shades of
growing,
amber
filled
and
Ellie
rose.
with
Little
quiet
Hawk
wonder.
came barreling
the lonely
toward them,
girl she'd
his
once
little
been
legs
could
pumping,
never have
a
imagined
wriggling
this life.
crayfish clutched
This love,
triumphantly in his
this
hands.
unshakable
Look,
sense of belonging.
I catched it all by myself.
As the sun dipped lower,
Tahoma scooped
painting
him
the
up,
prairie in shades of
crayfish and
amber
all,
and rose,
earning a squeal
little
of
Hawk
delight
came
as he
barreling
settled
toward
the
them,
boy on his
little
shoulders.
legs pumping.
Ellie took her
a
husband's
wriggling
hand
crayfish
as they turned
clutched toward
triumphantly
home,
in his hands.
where lamplight already
Look,
glowed
I
warm in the
catched it all
windows,
by myself.
where the rich smell of stew
Tahoma
simmering
scooped
over
him
the
up,
fire promised
crayfish
an
and
evening
all,
of stories
earning a
and
squeal
laughter.
of delight as he
Little
settled the
Hawk
boy
chattered
on his
above them,
shoulders.
his small
Ellie took her
voice
husband's
rising
hand
and
as
falling
they
with
turned toward
excitement
home,
as he
where
recounted his
lamplight
crayfish
already
hunt.
glowed warm in the
Tahoma's
windows,
thumb
where the
traced
rich
forever
circles
stew
over
simmering
Ellie's
over the
knuckles.
fire
A
promised
silent
an
language
evening of
all
stories
their
and
since the
laughter.
night.
Beneath
Seven
it all,
Comanche
little
warriors
Hawk
chattered
chattered
above
about
them.
Ellie's life,
His
lady
small
as his
voice
spoken
rising
lonely
prairie
and
woman
falling
in
with
her dark
excitement
eyes became
as
a
he
wife.
recounted his
A
crayfish
mother
hunt.
not without challenges.
Tahoma's thumb
now
built
rang
on something
clear
stronger
as
than
bird
over
song
Ellie's
across the
knuckles,
land.
deeper than
A
loneliness.
silent
The cabin
language
that once
fuller
stood
than
solitary
any
and
story
weathered
could
had
all
grown into a sturdy
as a
homestead
prairie
extra
stretched
lady
added
unspoken
with
around
truth.
passing year.
This
Was
same
there
land
that
that
had
vegetable
once
garden,
not
perfect
Ellie's prison,
prison,
not without
challenges,
greatest
and a
blessing,
built on
and as
something
the first
stronger
stars
than
solemn
linked to
responsibility
loneliness
beyond his years.
She knew no
Truer
matter
than
how
any
many
story
stories stood
could
at the
have
edge
ended.
of her flower
No matter
garden,
what the
the prairie
storms
stretched
stretched
endlessly around
here
the
would
swell
only
of
grow
another
deeper,
child
growing
that
within
love
her
only
daughter
this
stronger.
time.
Their
Now her
family
greatest
was forever
blessings
bound to this
proved
land
true.
and
And
to
first
each other.
stars
The late
blinked to
afternoon
life
sun
over
gilded
the
the
fields where
she knew no
almonds
matter
swayed
how
in the
many years
breeze. Did this
passed,
story
a crop
touch
no
home?
matter what
Taught
storm
their
if you
neighbors to
enjoyed
cultivate
following
roots
Ellie
here
and
would
Tahoma
only grow
journey
deeper.
from
It hadn't been
loneliness
easy
love
those
only
first
stronger.
years. Subscribe for more
Sideways
family
tales
forever
and
bound to
courage
whispers
and
when they went to each
connection.
other. Share the
The way
story
women
with
someone
someone
who
who
needs
needs
reminding
closer.
that
When
love
Tahoma walked
often
in
this
arrives,
story
when we
touched
least
time
expect it.
and
If you
relentless
enjoyed
kindness
following
have
worn
Ellie
away
and
suspicions,
Tahoma's
your
journey
support
from
helps us bring
loneliness to
more
love.
beautiful stories
A
to life. For
delighted
more
shriek
click
felt
subscribe
Ellie's
now
attention
and
and
never
creek
miss
where
a
little
new
Hawk
adventure. Share the
splashed in
story with
shallows.
someone who needs
His dark hair
reminding that
plastered to his
love
forehead.
often arrives
His grin
when
a
we least
perfect
expect
mirror
it
of his
stays
father's.
when we're brave
Tahoma
enough to let
stood
it in.
waist deep
Your
in the
support
water.
helps us
His
bring more
powerful
beautiful
frame
stories
still
to
as
life.
imposing as
Click
the day they
subscribe
met.
now and
Though
never
silver
miss
now
a new
threaded
adventure through his black braid. He caught their son mid-leap, tossing him high into the air before catching him effortlessly, the boys' laughter bubbling up like the creek over rocks. Again, 8. Again, little Hawk demanded, using the Comanche word for father that had been his first spoken word. Ellie's heart swelled as she watched them. How different her son's childhood was from her own, surrounded by love, by the traditions of two cultures, by a father whose steady presence was as constant as the North Star. The wooden rose Tahoma had carved her all those years ago sat on their mantel, its petals worn smooth from years of handling, a testament to how far they'd come. As if sensing her thoughts, Tahoma looked up, his eyes finding hers across the distance. Even after all this time, that simple glance could still make her breath catch. He said something to little Hawk before wading toward shore, water sluicing off his muscular frame. "You're supposed to be resting," he chided gently as he approached, placing a damp hand on her belly where their daughter kicked in response. Ellie swatted at him with a laugh. "I was resting." Then someone started hollering loud enough to scare the crows. Tahoma's deep chuckle rumbled against her side as he pulled her close. They stood together watching little Hawk attempt to catch minnows with his bare hands, his tongue poking out in concentration, just like Ellie did when she was kneading bread. Diani
Diani comes tomorrow, Tahoma said after a while, with others from the band. Ellie nodded, leaning into his solid warmth. The Comanche visited regularly now, their initial wariness replaced by genuine affection, especially for Little Hawk, who could switch between English and Comanche as easily as breathing. Diani, older and slower but still sharp-eyed, had become a grandfather figure to the boy, teaching him stories and skills passed down through generations. "Think they'll stay through the harvest?" Ellie asked. Tahoma pressed a kiss to her temple. "Longer. They want to be here when she comes." His hand splayed over her belly again. The simple certainty in his voice that there would be a harvest, that their daughter would arrive safely, that their family would continue growing filled Ellie with quiet wonder. The lonely girl she'd once been could never have imagined this life, this love, this unshakable sense of belonging. As the sun dipped lower, painting the prairie in shades of amber and rose, Little Hawk came barreling toward them, his little legs pumping, a wriggling crayfish clutched triumphantly in his hands. "Look, I catched it all by myself." Tahoma scooped him up, crayfish and all, earning a squeal of delight as he settled the boy on his shoulders. Ellie took her husband's hand as they turned toward home, where lamplight already glowed warm in the windows, where the rich smell of stew simmering over the fire promised an evening of stories and laughter. Little Hawk chattered above them, his small voice rising and falling with excitement as he recounted his crayfish hunt. Tahoma's thumb traced slow circles over Ellie's knuckles, a silent language all their own. And beneath it all, steady as a heartbeat, lay the unspoken truth: this was there forever. Not perfect, not without challenges, but built on something stronger than fear, deeper than loneliness, truer than any storybook ending. The prairie stretched endlessly around them, the same land that had once been Ellie's prison, now her greatest blessing. And as the first stars blinked to life overhead, she knew no matter how many years passed, no matter what storms came, their roots here would only grow deeper, their love only stronger, their family forever bound to this land and to each other. The end. Did this story touch your heart? If you enjoyed following Ellie and Tahoma's journey from loneliness to love, subscribe for more heartfelt tales of courage and connection. Share the story with someone who needs reminding that love often arrives when we least expect it and stays when we're brave enough to let it in. Your support helps us bring more beautiful stories to life. Click subscribe now and never miss a new adventure.